Good evening, and welcome back to Drowsy History. Tonight, we're traveling to the coldest, quietest places on Earth, the frozen seas of the far north, and the white continent at the bottom of the world. We're going back to the great age of polar exploration, roughly the middle of the 19th century through the early years of the 20th, when wooden ships sailed off the edge of every map, and ordinary men, sailors, stokers, carpenters, and cooks signed their names to voyages that would swallow years of their lives, and sometimes the lives themselves. Tonight, you're going to find out why you wouldn't survive as a polar explorer. And don't worry, we'll take it slowly. There's no rush where we're going. The ice has been waiting for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer for you. Before we set sail, if you're new here, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a journey like this one. And wherever you are tonight, whether you're tucked in bed, riding out a storm, or lying awake in the small hours, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this quiet little community stretch across the world, every time zone and season, all of us drifting off together. Some of you are listening in summer heat, some in deep winter, and tonight all of us are headed somewhere far colder than any of it. So dim the lights, pull the blankets a little higher, let your shoulders sink into the mattress, and let the day loosen its grip on you. Tonight there is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. There is only the slow creak of a wooden ship, the hiss of wind over endless snow, and the long, patient dark of the polar night. Let's begin. It begins as so many stories of the sea begin on a crowded dock. Picture a gray morning in London, or Hull, or the whaling port of Dundee, somewhere in the second half of the 19th century. The air smells of tar and coal smoke and river mud. Gulls wheel and complain overhead. And tied up along the quay sits a ship, not a large one, you notice, not nearly as large as you expected. Her hull painted black, her masts bare, her decks crowded with crates and coils of rope, and men moving with the unhurried purpose of people who have done this work all their lives. You are not a famous man. That's the first thing to understand about the people who actually went to the ends of the earth. History remembers the names of the captains and the commanders: Franklin, Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen, Nansen, but ships are not sailed by captains alone. For every officer whose portrait hangs in a museum, there were dozens of men whose names appear only in the ship's articles: able seamen, firemen and stokers, sailmakers, coopers, carpenters, cooks, and stewards. Men who could splice a line and stand a watch, who had spent their working lives in merchant ships or fishing boats or the engine rooms of steamers. Men, in other words, very much like you might have been. Why would you sign on for such a voyage? The honest answer for most was the money. In the Royal Navy's Arctic expeditions, sailors were promised double pay for discovery service, a powerful thing for a man supporting a family on a seaman's wages. Others were drawn by the simple fact of steady employment, years of guaranteed food and pay at a time when work along the waterfront came and went with the seasons. Some wanted to escape something: debts, grief, a life that had narrowed around them, and some, it must be said, simply wanted to see it. The ice, the places on the chart where the line stopped and the blankness began. There were men who heard about a ship bound for the frozen ends of the earth and felt something in them lean toward it, the way a compass needle leans north. Legend says that when Ernest Shackleton was recruiting for his Antarctic expeditions, he placed a newspaper advertisement promising small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, and a doubtful return. No one has ever found that advertisement, and it was probably never printed, but the story survives because it tells a deeper truth. The men who applied knew more or less what they were signing up for, and they applied anyway, in astonishing numbers. When Shackleton sought a crew for the Endurance in 1914, thousands of letters poured in, from sailors and scientists certainly, but also from clerks and shopkeepers and at least 3 girls who offered to disguise themselves as men. For every berth on a polar ship, there were hundreds of hopefuls left standing on the dock. If you were one of the lucky ones, and lucky is a word we will return to again and again with a raised eyebrow, your selection was often remarkably casual. Shackleton was famous for interviews that lasted a few minutes and turned on questions that seemed to have nothing to do with the job. He asked one physicist if he could sing. Not opera, Shackleton explained. He just wanted men who could shout a song with the others, men who would keep their tempers and their humor when everything else was gone. He chose for character because he understood something that you, standing on that dock with your sea bag over your shoulder, do not yet understand, that the ice does not test your strength first. It tests your patience, your cheerfulness, and your ability to live for years pressed shoulder to shoulder with the same few faces. There was a medical examination of a sort. A doctor listened to your chest, looked at your teeth, asked about your history. Sound teeth mattered more than you might think. There would be no dentist where you were going, and a man crippled by toothache in the middle of a frozen sea was a problem with no good solution. But the examinations missed as much as they caught. Men sailed with weak hearts, with old injuries, with conditions no stethoscope of the era could find. The truth is that no examination on Earth could tell whether a man would endure the polar regions, because nothing in ordinary life resembled what was coming. Then came the kit. If you sailed with the Royal Navy in the Franklin era, you were issued thick woolens, oiled outer garments, sea boots, mittens, a knife, a plate, a pannikin for your tea. Later expeditions added windproof outer clothing of tightly woven cotton gabardine, fur mitts, and boots of reindeer hide. You signed the ship's articles, your name, your rating, your wages, in a ledger that for some expeditions would one day be read by historians as a list of the lost. You did not know that. You knew only that the pay was good, the ship was sound as far as you could tell, and the officers seemed to know their business. And then, one morning, you sailed. These departures were public events, sometimes enormous ones. When Franklin's ships, Erebus and Terror, left England in May of 1845, bound for the Northwest Passage with 129 men aboard, the newspapers wrote about them with total confidence, as though success were a formality. Crowds lined the docks, handkerchiefs waved, wives and mothers watched the masts shrink toward the horizon. When the Endurance left for the South in August of 1914, the world was 3 days into a great war, and Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the Admiralty, and received back a one-word telegram: proceed. So they proceeded, down the Thames and out into the gray Atlantic, while behind them the lamps of Europe were going out. Standing at the rail, watching your country sink into the sea behind you, you would have felt what sailors have always felt at the start of a long voyage, that strange braid of homesickness and freedom. But a polar voyage was different from any other, and somewhere in your chest you knew it. A merchant sailor bound for India could count the months until his return. You could not. The ice would decide when you came home, or whether you came home, and the ice kept its own calendar. Some of the men leaning on that rail beside you would be gone 4 years. Some would return with fingers and toes missing. And on some ships, though no one said it aloud, with the gulls still crying overhead and the land still in sight, no one would return at all. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the sea is open, the wind is fair, and the ship beneath your feet is alive and creaking, carrying you south or north toward the ice. Let's go below decks and see the world you'll be living in. The first thing that would surprise you about a polar ship is how small it was. The Endurance, one of the strongest wooden ships ever built, was only 144 feet long, shorter than half a modern city block, and into her went 28 men, 69 sled dogs, a cat, tons of coal, and supplies for years. Franklin's Erebus and Terror were converted bomb vessels, stout little warships built to carry heavy mortars, chosen for polar work because their hulls were already massively reinforced. Even so, each was barely 100 feet long. Your entire world, for years on end, would be a wooden box you could walk from end to end in under a minute. These ships were built, or rebuilt, like fortresses. Their bows were solid wood, many feet thick, sheathed in iron or in greenheart, a South American timber so dense it barely floats. Their frames were doubled and trebled, their hulls braced inside with extra beams until the lower decks felt like the inside of a barrel. The Norwegian ship Fram, built for Fridtjof Nansen in the 1890s, was designed with a smooth, rounded hull so that when the ice squeezed her, she would rise out of the water like a cherry pit pinched between two fingers and sit on top of the floes rather than be crushed between them. Shipwrights understood the enemy. Whether the men did on the day they carried their sea bags aboard is another question. Below decks, you lived in the forecastle or the mess deck, in a space lit by oil lamps and one or two skylights, where the headroom was so low that tall men learned to walk with a permanent stoop. Your bed was a hammock slung from the beams, or a narrow wooden bunk against the hull, with a curtain for privacy if you were fortunate. Your belongings lived in a single chest. The air down there was a thick, familiar soup: coal smoke, tobacco, tar, wet wool, lamp oil, salt meat boiling in the galley, and the breath of dozens of men. Sailors of the age didn't complain about it. It was simply what a ship smelled like, and in the months to come, in the deep cold, that warm fug below decks would come to smell like safety itself. The voyage out was long before the ice ever appeared. Ships bound for the Antarctic might sail for months, down the Atlantic, through the tropics, where the tar bubbled in the deck seams and the dogs panted miserably in their kennels, then on to the last outposts: Madeira, Buenos Aires, Hobart, or the bleak whaling station at South Georgia, where the men got their final letters, their final fresh vegetables, their final everything. Then south again, into the band of ocean sailors called the Roaring Forties and the Furious Fifties, where the wind circles the bottom of the world without any land to stop it, and the waves build into gray mountains that roll forever. If you have never been seasick, truly seasick, count yourself blessed. In those latitudes, the little polar ships, built round bottomed and strong rather than fast and graceful, rolled like barrels. They rolled until the dogs howled, until cargo broke loose in the holds, until seasoned sailors who had spent 20 years at sea hung over the lee rail in misery. Water found its way everywhere, down hatches, through seams, into your bunk, into your boots. For days at a time you lived soaked, braced, and queasy, eating cold food because the galley fire couldn't be kept lit, and sleeping in snatches with one arm hooked around something solid. And here's the thing to hold on to: this part, the part that would already have broken most of us, was considered the easy stretch. This was the commute. You would not have made that commute alone either, and not only in the company of men. A polar ship was a floating farmyard. The Endurance carried her 69 sled dogs in kennels bolted along the deck, where they rode out the gales howling their opinions of the Southern Ocean. The Terra Nova carried 19 ponies in stalls below the forecastle, where in the worst storms men spent whole nights holding the terrified animals on their feet as the ship tried to roll them off them. There were cats. The Endurance had a famous one, the carpenter's tabby, known to all hands as Mrs. Chippy, who patrolled the deck above the dog kennels with what every diarist agreed it was deliberate insolence. There were dogs who became ship's characters, ponies with names and reputations, and on some voyages, pigs and sheep destined for the table who acquired dangerously the status of pets along the way. Caring for the animals was the sailor's work: feeding, mucking out, exercising, comforting, and around that work grew the attachments that make the animal chapters of these expeditions, for many readers, the most beloved and the most bittersweet in all the diaries. For now, though, in the long swells of the voyage out, the animals were simply company, warm bodies, absurd personalities, a daily round of chores with a heartbeat in it, and proof, every feeding time, that the little wooden world was still alive. Then, one day, the sea began to change. The water turned a deeper, colder green. Strange birds appeared: petrels, fulmars, and finally the albatross, wheeling on 10-foot wings without ever seeming to beat them. The air took on an edge that no jacket quite kept out. And then someone at the masthead called down the word everyone had been waiting for, and you came up on deck and you saw it, your first iceberg standing on the horizon like a white cathedral trailing a skirt of mist. Men who wrote diaries on these voyages almost always recorded that moment. However hard the years ahead would be, almost no one ever forgot the beauty of that first ice: blue-white, silent, impossibly large, glowing as though lit from inside. Soon the bergs multiplied, and then came the pack ice, first scattered chunks, called brash, hissing along the hull, then floes the size of fields, then a white world from horizon to horizon, broken only by dark lanes of open water. The ship slowed. The engine thumped gently. The captain or the ice pilot climbed to the crow's nest. A barrel lashed to the mast, and from there steered the ship through the maze, calling course changes down to the deck, a road that opened and closed at the whim of wind and current. And the strangest thing happened to the sound of the world. The waves stopped. The endless southern ocean swell, which had tormented you for weeks, was smothered flat by the weight of the ice. The ship glided through still black water, between white fields, in a silence so deep that men spoke quietly without knowing why. You had arrived at the edge of the polar world. The ship, your warm, smelly, creaking wooden home, was now the only human thing in an area larger than most countries. Everything you would eat, burn, wear, and shelter under for the next several years was inside her hull. There would be no resupply, no mail, no doctor but the one aboard, no rescue that could be summoned faster than a season. From here on, you lived by the ship, and the ice would decide the rest. Let's talk about the cold. Not the cold, not the cold of a winter morning, or a parking lot in January, or even the worst night of the worst blizzard you've ever lived through. Those colds are visitors. Polar cold is a landlord. It owns the land, the sea, the air, and everything that enters them, and it collects its rent from every living thing, every minute of every day, without ever once relenting. The numbers themselves are hard to feel. On the Antarctic coast in winter, temperatures fell to 30 and 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. On the high inland plateau, explorers recorded 50s and 60s below, and in the modern era, instruments on that same ice have measured temperatures colder than 100 below. In the Arctic, men wintering aboard frozen-in ships saw mercury thermometers fail because mercury itself freezes solid at around 40 below. They switched to spirit thermometers and kept recording hour after hour in numbers that read like typographical errors. But the numbers were only half the story. The other half was wind. At Cape Denison, where Douglas Mawson's expedition built its hut in 1912, the wind blew at hurricane force for days at a time, averaging 50 miles an hour around the calendar, the windiest place at sea level ever measured on Earth. Cold air that is moving strips heat from a body many times faster than cold air that is still. 40 below in a gale is not weather. It is a force, like gravity, that simply takes things from you. What does that kind of cold actually do to a person? It begins at the edges. Your nose, your cheeks, your ears, your fingers, your toes. The body, sensing the emergency, quietly closes the blood vessels at its borders to protect the warm core and abandons the frontier. Exposed skin in deep cold can freeze in minutes, in wind, in less than one. The freezing itself is strangely painless at first. A numbness, a waxy white patch a companion might notice on your cheek before you felt anything at all. Polar travelers learn to watch each other's faces constantly, the way you might watch a campfire, and the phrase, "your nose has gone," was as routine as a remark about the weather. The remedy was warmth, applied gently, a bare hand cupped over the frozen spot, your own or a friend's until the blood crept back. And when it crept back, then came the pain, a deep burning ache that men said was far worse than the freezing. Your breath became a presence of its own. Every exhale froze instantly into a tiny cloud of crystals. Explorers called the sound, it made a soft rustle like whispering, and that moisture had to go somewhere. It went onto you. It frosted your eyelashes until they froze together and you had to thaw them apart with your fingers. It built ice in your beard, your balaclava, the fur edge of your hood, until by the end of a day's march, your head was encased in a helmet of your own frozen breath, and getting your face free at night was a small engineering project. Men's beards froze to their clothing. Balaclavas froze to beards. There are accounts of men whose frozen face coverings had to be cracked off like plaster. And here is the detail that surprises almost everyone. The great enemy of the polar traveler was not the cold itself, but sweat. Hauling a heavy sledge is brutal work, and a working body produces heat and moisture no matter the temperature of the air. That moisture soaked into your layers of wool, and the moment you stopped moving, it froze. Your clothing, your only shelter, the thin wall between you and the landlord, turned stiff as sheet metal. Men climbed out of their hauling harnesses at the end of a march and stood in suits of frozen armor, their jackets crackling when they bent their arms. The clothing of the era made this worse. There was no waterproof, breathable fabric, no down parka, no synthetic fleece. You wore layer upon layer of wool, undershirts, sweaters, jerseys, under an outer suit of tightly woven cotton gabardine that broke the wind but held the damp. On your hands, wool mitts inside fur outer mitts, slung on a cord around your neck, because a dropped mitt in a gale could cost you a hand. On your feet, finnesko, boots made of reindeer fur with the hair left on, stuffed with a dried Norwegian sedge grass called sennegrass, which pulled moisture away from your feet and could be shaken out and dried after a fashion each night. Getting dressed and undressed was a discipline in itself. Buttons and everything closed with buttons or ties, for the zipper had not yet conquered the world, had to be worked with fingers that lost feeling in seconds. Men learned to do everything in mitts, or in the few heartbeats their bare hands could be trusted, and they learned the hard rules of metal, that a bare hand on a metal fitting at 40 below freezes to it instantly, skinning your palm like a glove, and that even a metal pannikin of scalding tea could frost over before you finished drinking it. Hot water flung into the air at those temperatures never lands. It bursts into a cloud of ice crystals with a sound like a sheet being torn and drifts away. At night, in a tent on the trail, the cold pressed in closest of all. Your sleeping bag was reindeer hide, fur inward, and by a week into a sledging journey, it was no longer soft. The moisture of your body had soaked it and frozen, and each evening you came off the march to find your bed, a coffin-shaped block of frozen fur, which you had to enter anyway, forcing your way in inch by inch and thawing it with your own dwindling heat, a process that could take an hour of shivering before anything like sleep was possible. Above you, your breath froze to the inside of the tent, and every gust of wind shook it down again as a fine interior snowfall. Men woke with their hair frozen to the bag, rime on the blankets, ice in the folds of everything. And sometimes the weather simply closed the world. A true polar blizzard was not a snowstorm as you know it. Much of the snow in it had fallen long ago and was merely being picked up and driven horizontally at 60 or 80 miles an hour. A white, roaring river of ice dust in which a man could lose sight of his own tent at 3 paces and in which parties simply did not travel. So they lay up. For a day, sometimes for 4, 5, 6 days at a stretch, the men lay in their bags in the buzzing, shuddering tent while the wind did its work and time went strange. They slept enormous amounts. They told stories until the stories ran out. They recited poetry, planned imaginary meals, mended clothing by feel, and rationed out the reading material. There are accounts of a single battered novel being torn into sections and circulated through the sleeping bags page by page. The cook crawled out of his bag twice a day to work the primus, and the hot mugs went around, and then there was nothing again but the wind, hour upon hour, that huge, unceasing freight train roar that the men said they eventually stopped hearing, until the moment, sometimes in the middle of the night, when it stopped, and the silence woke them like a shout. I want you to notice something, though, here in your warm bed, with your blankets pulled high. The men who lived this seldom wrote about the cold with hatred. They wrote about it the way sailors write about the sea, as a vast fact, dangerous and magnificent, that made the warm moments unspeakably precious. A mug of hoosh at the end of a march, a pipe in the lee of a snow wall, the moment in the frozen sleeping bag when at last a thin layer of warmth formed around you and held. Cold that absolute gave warmth a flavor that no comfortable person will ever quite taste. Hold on to that thought. We're going to need it because next we have to talk about food and about hunger. An army, Napoleon supposedly said, marches on its stomach. A polar expedition crawled on its stomach, and the stomach was rarely full. Of all the reasons you wouldn't survive as a polar explorer, food, its dullness, its scarcity, and the strange disease hiding inside its absence might be the most relentless. Aboard ship, in the early months, the eating was plain but plentiful. Salt beef and salt pork from casks, soaked overnight to draw out the brine and boiled into submission. Pea soup, dried vegetables, tinned meats and soups, which in the 1840s were a thrilling new technology. Franklin's expedition sailed with thousands upon thousands of tins, ordered in a great rush from a contractor named Stephen Goldner, sealed with lead solder, and trusted absolutely. And everywhere, at every meal, the foundation stone of nautical eating, ship's biscuit, hardtack, a flour and water tile baked until it could survive years in a sack, and teeth could barely survive it. You softened it in your tea or in your soup, or you gnawed it patiently like a dog with a bone, and on a well-run ship, you might also get fresh bread on Sundays, and the cook became, without exaggeration, one of the most important men alive. But the ship's table was the good life. The true test came on the trail when men left the ship and hauled their food behind them, and every ounce had to be dragged by human muscle across a frozen desert. Sledging rations were an exercise in brutal arithmetic. The standard fare was built around pemmican, dried powdered beef mixed half and half with melted fat, pressed into bricks. It looked like dense brown soap. It was, by the standards of any kitchen on earth, dreadful, and the men dreamed about it the way you might dream about a holiday dinner, because pemmican was the closest thing to richness they had. Each evening, the cook of the tent chipped pieces of it into a pot of melted snow with crumbled biscuit, boiled it into a thick stew called hoosh, and 3 or 4 men sat in their frozen sleeping bags and spooned it down in a reverent silence, scraping the pot so clean it scarcely needed washing. Beyond hoosh, there was tea, sugar, a little butter, a few squares of chocolate, biscuit, and that was all. The same meal, morning and night, for weeks, for months. The arithmetic was the cruel part. A man hauling a heavy sledge through soft snow burned somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 or 7,000 calories a day, the output of an athlete in the hardest training on earth. The rations on most British sledging journeys supplied perhaps 4,000, sometimes 4.5. The gap, day after day, week after week, was paid out of the men's own bodies. They were, in the most literal sense, slowly consuming themselves, first their fat, then their muscle, while performing labor that would stagger a draft horse. Diaries from the long marches return constantly, almost hypnotically, to food. Men confess to each other their food dreams: enormous breakfasts, sirloins, sweat puddings, tables groaning under roasts that always in the dream vanished just before the first bite. They played elaborate games of imagination, planning the meals they would eat at home, course by course, hour after hour, while their harnesses creaked and the sledge runners hissed behind them. Hunger even reshaped their small society and produced one of the gentlest rituals in all of polar history. When hoosh was divided, no portion ever looked equal to a starving man, so the British parties used a ceremony they called shut-eye. One man turned his back or closed his eyes. The cook pointed at a portion and asked whose, and the man who could not see answered with a name. Portion by portion, fate did the dividing, and no one could quarrel with fate. Grown men, naval officers, and hardened seamen submitted to this little nursery ritual every night on the ice because they understood themselves well enough to know that hunger could make children of them all. And behind ordinary hunger waited something worse, a shadow that had stalked sailors for centuries: scurvy. Today, we can say the word in a sentence. Scurvy is a deficiency of vitamin C. But vitamin C would not be isolated until the 1930s, and the men of the great expeditions sailed without knowing what scurvy was, what caused it, or why their remedies sometimes worked and sometimes failed. They knew only what it did. It began softly, a deep weariness that rest didn't touch, an ache in the joints, a lowness of spirit. Then gums grew tender. Old scars, wounds healed for decades, reopened as though the body were a ledger and time itself was being unwritten. Bruises bloomed from nowhere. A man with scurvy did not so much sicken as slowly come unfastened. The Royal Navy had long fought it with citrus juice, and for a time had largely beaten it, but in one of history's quiet ironies, the Navy had switched from Mediterranean lemons to West Indian limes, which carried far less of the vital vitamin, and the juice was often stored and processed in ways that destroyed what little remained. The shield the men trusted was, without anyone knowing it, half empty. What actually saved polar expeditions, when they were saved, was fresh meat. Seal and penguin in the south, seal and bear and muskox in the north. Fresh killed and lightly cooked, it carried just enough vitamin C to hold the line, and the expeditions that ate it fared the best, though they argued endlessly about why. So if you had signed on as an ordinary sailor, your duties would have included butchery on an industrial scale, hunting seals along the ice edge, hauling the carcasses home, stacking frozen meat like cordwood, and rendering blubber, which burned in the stoves and lamps with a smoky orange flame and a smell that soaked into everything you owned. Fresh seal steak, fried in its own blubber, was genuinely good. The men praised it. Penguin was darker, oilier, fishier. One explorer said that if you imagined beef, cod, and duck cooked together in a pot with blubber for sauce, you would be getting close. You learned not to be particular. Particular men went hungry, and hungry men, as we'll see, did not last. There is one more thing to say about food, and it's a quiet, domestic thing. The cook, whether the ship's cook with his coal range, or the tent cook crouched over a little brass primus stove, pumping it alight with numb fingers, held the expedition's spirit in his hands twice a day. Melting snow for water took fuel, and fuel was weighed to the ounce, so every hot meal was a small victory of planning. When the fuel ran low, men ate their pemmican cold, gnawing at it like toffee, and everyone understood what cold hoosh meant without anyone saying it aloud. But when the primus roared, and the tent filled with steam, and the smell of dinner, and the mugs were passed hand to hand in the lamplight, those were the moments the men remembered as happiness. It takes so little, at 40 below, to feel rich. Before we go any further into the catalog of suffering, we should pause for something important, because everything we've described so far might leave you with the impression that the polar regions were simply unlivable, that no human being could ever truly belong there. And that is not true. While the expedition ships groaned in the ice, and their crews shivered in damp wool and sickened for want of fresh food, there were people, whole communities, families, children, grandparents, living rich and capable lives in the very heart of the Arctic, as their ancestors had for thousands of years. The Inuit and the other peoples of the far north were not surviving the Arctic, they were home. Consider clothing, since we've felt the failure of wool on our own backs tonight. Inuit winter dress was a precision instrument refined over countless generations, 2 layers of caribou skin, the inner worn with the fur against the body, the outer with the fur facing the weather, trapping a deep blanket of warmed air between them. Caribou hair is hollow, each strand its own tiny insulator, and the result was clothing so effective that a properly dressed hunter could sit motionless for hours in temperatures that would have disabled a Royal Navy sledging party in their gabardine and jerseys. The garments were cut loose for ventilation because Inuit tailors understood perfectly the lesson the explorers kept learning the hard way, that sweat is the true enemy, and a hunter regulated his temperature with a hood thrown back here, a hem lifted there, staying dry where the sailor soaked and froze. On the feet, boots of sealskin, their seams sewn waterproof with a delicacy of stitching that European observers marveled at. That sewing, it should be said plainly, was the work of women, and it was understood across the Arctic as exactly what it was: life and death engineering. A family's survival was sewn into every seam, and a skilled seamstress was as essential to a hunting band as the strongest hunter in it. Or consider shelter. We've huddled tonight in drafty wooden huts and frozen tents, but the snow house, the igloo, was perhaps the most elegant solution to cold that human beings have ever devised. A skilled builder, working alone with a long knife, could cut blocks from wind-packed snow and spiral them up into a dome in an hour or two, a house built from the very substance of the storm, anywhere, on demand. And snow, full of trapped air, is a remarkable insulator. Inside, with the entrance dug low so the cold air pooled below the sleeping platform, with bodies and a single soapstone lamp for heat, the temperature rose to something genuinely comfortable while a blizzard raged outside at 50 below. The lamp itself, the kulik, deserves a moment of its own here on a sleep channel. A shallow crescent of carved stone filled with seal oil, with a wick of moss or Arctic cotton trimmed and tended traditionally by the woman of the household. Its low flame was heat, light, cook stove, and clothes dryer all at once, and it burned through the polar night with a soft, steady golden glow, the warm center of a warm home, in the middle of the coldest place on earth. Whole childhoods unfolded by that light. Stories were told by it, generation after generation, while the wind did its enormous work outside the snow walls. If any image tonight deserves to follow you down into sleep, let it be that one. And the food problem, the hunger and the scurvy that unmade the expeditions, the Inuit had solved so completely that scurvy was essentially unknown among them. Their diet was almost entirely meat and fish, much of it eaten fresh, and some of it eaten raw, and fresh, lightly cooked or uncooked meat, as we've seen, carries enough vitamin C to keep the disease away entirely. What looked to Victorian visitors like the absence of civilized food was, in nutritional fact, the precise cure for the ailment killing civilization's sailors. The hunting that supplied it was a discipline of almost unimaginable patience. A hunter standing motionless over a seal's breathing hole in the sea ice, for the seal keeps several and chooses freely among them, waiting in the cold, sometimes for hours, for the soft exhalation below. Patience again. It always comes back to patience at the ends of the earth. Now, what did the explorers make of all this? Here the story becomes one of the quiet hinges of history, because the expeditions that learned from the Inuit thrived, and many of those that would not suffered for it, and the difference is written across the whole age. The Royal Navy of the Franklin era, by and large, would not. It sailed north, carrying England with it, naval routine, naval clothing, naval food in soldered tins, confident that discipline and equipment would master any latitude. The Arctic's own residents were regarded as curiosities to be traded with, not as the holders of the answer key. And so, British seamen man-hauled in wool past country where Inuit families were living comfortably, and the contrast, looking back, is one of the saddest and strangest sights of the century. But some men paid attention, and their names are worth remembering tonight. John Ray, a Scottish doctor with the Hudson's Bay Company, learned from the Inuit and the northern fur trade peoples how to travel as they did, light, fast, living substantially off the land in fur clothing, building snow houses as he went. And he covered distances on foot that naval sledging parties could scarcely credit, mapping great stretches of the Arctic coast with small parties and no disasters. It was Ray, traveling Inuit fashion and listening to Inuit testimony, who brought home the first true word of the Franklin expedition's fate, news so hard that Victorian England largely refused to hear it, and punished the messenger with a long coldness of its own. History has been kinder to him since. The maps were on his side all along. And then there was the young Norwegian who took the lesson all the way. When Roald Amundsen made the first complete voyage through the Northwest Passage between 1903 and 1906 in a tiny converted herring sloop with a crew of 6, his ship spent 2 winters frozen in at a harbor on King William Island, the very region that had swallowed Franklin's 129. For Amundsen, those 2 winters were not captivity, they were university. The local Netsilik people camped nearby, traded, visited, and taught how to build snow houses, how to dress entirely in caribou skin, how to handle dogs, how to live. Amundsen, unusual among the gold-braided men of his era, understood that he was the student and studied accordingly. And when 5 years later he stood at the South Pole, having traveled there and back with dog teams in fur clothing, with his men gaining weight on the return journey, While others starved, he was cashing, by his own account, the education of those 2 Arctic winters. The most efficient polar journey of the age was, in a real sense, Netsilik knowledge, carried to the opposite end of the planet. The American expeditions toward the North Pole leaned on that knowledge even more directly. Robert Peary's long campaigns were built around Inuit clothing, Inuit style sledges, Inuit dog handling, and the employment of Inuit families themselves, who did a great share of the building, sewing, hunting, and driving on which the whole enterprise ran. And the figure closest to that world was Matthew Henson, Peary's right hand across nearly 2 decades, a black American who had gone to sea as a cabin boy at 12. Henson learned the Inuktitut language, as no other member of those expeditions did, mastered the dog sledge and the snow house, built and repaired the sledges with his own hands, and was, by the testimony of the Inuit themselves, the most capable traveler the expeditions ever fielded. When the final dash for the pole was made in 1909, Henson and 4 Inuit men, Uta, Agingwa, Siglu, and Ukwea, stood there with Peary. By several accounts, Henson's party arrived first. He returned home to an America that gave him a clerk's job and 40 years of near silence before the honors finally came. The Arctic, for what it's worth, had judged him correctly the first time. So hold this part of the story alongside everything else tonight. The polar regions were never in themselves unsurvivable. They were unsurvivable for outsiders, for men who arrived, as you would have arrived, as I would have arrived, carrying the wrong inheritance, wool instead of caribou skin, tins instead of fresh seal, 3 years of supplies instead of 10,000 years of accumulated knowing. The explorers were attempting in a single voyage what the peoples of the North had perfected across hundreds of generations, and the ice graded them all on the same curve. That, in the end, may be the deepest answer to our question tonight. You wouldn't have survived as a polar explorer for the same reason the explorers so often didn't, because survival there was never about courage at all. It was about knowledge, patient, local, unwritten, handed from grandmother to mother to daughter in the glow of a seal oil lamp, and no ship ever carried enough of it from the south. Now we come to the strangest hardship of all, the one no amount of muscle or seamanship could do anything about. At the ends of the earth, in winter, the sun goes away, not behind clouds, away. Depending on how far north or south you wintered, the sun set sometime in the autumn and simply did not rise again for 2, 3, 4 months. No dawn, no noon, only a long twilight that faded, day by day, into a darkness that owned everything, and a silence in which the only clock was the ship's bell, and the only calendar was hope. Expeditions prepared for the night the way a household prepares for a siege. If the ship was frozen into the sea ice, and many wintered that way deliberately, the men banked snow against her hull for insulation, stretched canvas awnings over her decks, and turned her into a strange hybrid of vessel and burrow. Stoves were kept burning on a strict ration of coal. Even so, warmth was a local rumor rather than a fact. Near the stove, men sweltered. Against the hull, water froze in the wash basins, frost furred the bolt heads, and a man's breath fell as snow onto his own blankets. Those wintering ashore built huts, a single wooden room, in most cases, for a dozen or 2 dozen men, with bunks along the walls, a long table down the middle, a stove, and acetylene or oil lamp, and around it all the wind, which at some stations blew so hard and so constantly that going outside to read the weather instruments meant crawling on hands and knees along a lifeline. The great enemy of the polar night was not the dark itself. It was what the dark did to time. Imagine it with me, slowly. You wake in your bunk, though wake is a generous word for surfacing out of a doze, in a black room where morning is only a word the officers use. Breakfast is at 8 by the clock, because the clock is all there is. Then the day's small work, feeding the dogs, cutting ice for water, reading the instruments, mending clothes and harness, shoveling out the doorway again. Lunch, more small work, so dinner, and then the long evening, which is identical to the morning, which was identical to yesterday, which will be identical to tomorrow for 100 days. The men called the feeling by different names in different eras, but every wintering party met it. A gray listlessness, a fraying of tempers, the way a companion's perfectly innocent habit, the sound of his chewing, a phrase he used too often, could begin to fill the whole world. The first crew ever to winter in the Antarctic, aboard the Belgica in 1898, met the polar night unprepared, locked in drifting pack ice, and the record of that winter is sobering. Men sank into deep melancholy, health failed, and the ship's doctor, an American named Frederick Cook, improvised treatments with the desperation of a man bailing a boat. Yet his improvisations turned out to be quietly brilliant. He sat the most affected men in front of the open stove fire, bathing them in light and heat, a kind of light therapy, decades before the term existed. He prescribed fresh seal and penguin meat. He organized walks on the ice and kept minds occupied. The Belgica's winter became the polar world's hardest lesson, and the expeditions that followed studied it. The dark was a force, like cold and hunger, and it had to be rationed against, planned against, fought. So the later expeditions fought it, and the way they fought it is, I think, one of the loveliest chapters in this whole story. They fought the dark with structure and with silliness. Routine was sacred, meals at fixed hours, work parties, scientific readings around the clock, Sunday services, a weekly bath if water allowed. And on that scaffolding of routine, they hung every entertainment human ingenuity could devise in a wooden room at the bottom of the world. They gave lectures. Each officer and scientist took a turn, and so the seamen of the Discovery heard about volcanoes, motor engines, and the private lives of penguins. They printed newspapers and books, typeset, illustrated, and bound by lamplight, filled with in-jokes, poems, and gentle libels of one another. Shackleton's men on one expedition produced an entire printed book, Aurora Australis, its covers cut from packing crates. They staged plays in costume with painted scenery, to audiences weeping with laughter. There were gramophones and concertinas, chess tournaments and endless card games, birthdays celebrated with hoarded delicacies, and above all, the great feast of Midwinter's Day in June, the Antarctic Christmas, when the table was laid with the best of everything. Toasts were drunk to the sun's return, and for one evening the hut blazed with light against a continent of dark. Even the housekeeping of the winter months took on a ceremonial weight, because every small domestic act was a vote for order against the dark. Saturday nights in many ships and huts meant the weekly scrub, decks and table boards sluiced and stoned, the living quarters set to rights, followed, where water and fuel allowed, by the ration of bathing. A few inches of warmed water in a tin tub behind a blanket curtain, taken in strict rotation and treated by men weeks removed from their last wash as an almost spiritual event. Clothes were laundered in melted snow and dried on lines strung over the stove, so that the hut spent half the winter under a ceiling of steaming socks. Hair was cut, sometimes well, by a shipmate with genuine talent, and sometimes as a deliberate entertainment, with results photographed and treasured. Sunday brought divine service, hymns sung to a wheezing harmonium, or simply to memory, and then the closest thing the week offered to an afternoon off. None of it was necessary, strictly speaking, in the way that coal and seal meat were necessary. All of it was necessary in the other way. A shaved chin at 70 degrees south was a small declaration that the dark was a circumstance and not a condition, and the dark, for all its weight, gave something back. Step outside the hut with me for a moment, properly dressed just for a minute or two. The cold takes your breath. The silence is total, a pressure on the ears. And overhead, the sky is doing something no one who saw it ever managed to fully describe. The aurora, southern or northern lights, depending which end of the earth holds you, hangs across the stars in slow curtains of green and violet, folding and unfolding, brightening and fading, sometimes filling half the heavens, utterly silent, utterly indifferent, beautiful beyond any use. Men who had been cooped up for months, quarreling over chess and chewing noises, stood together in the snow with their heads tipped back and forgot to be cold. The diaries grope for comparisons, searchlights, draperies, rivers of light, and then, one after another, give up and simply say, "No one can imagine it who has not seen it." Then, at last, in the depths of late winter, came the rumor of the sun. First, a pale stain of twilight on the northern horizon at noon, or southern in the Arctic, growing day by day. Then color, bands of rose and gold, where the light gathered below the rim of the world. Men climbed hills, and rigging for a better view, checking the almanac, counting down. And on the appointed day, the upper edge of the sun itself broke the horizon, a sliver of unbearable brightness, often distorted by the freezing air into a shimmering bar of fire, and stayed for a few minutes and sank again. That was all. A few minutes. The men cheered and toasted it and wrote about it as though greeting a friend back from the dead. You and I see the sun rise every morning and never once think to cheer. That, perhaps, is the polar night's parting gift to you tonight. Somewhere under your sternum, a small, warm gratitude for the ordinary daylight that will find your window tomorrow, right on time. We need to talk about the ice itself, because the ice was not scenery. It was not a white floor on which adventures happened. The ice was a living, moving, muscular thing, the largest moving object most of these men would ever encounter, and it is the single greatest reason you wouldn't have survived. The cold weakens you, hunger drains you, the dark wears you down, but the ice is what actually closes the trap. Sea ice first. The frozen ocean is not a solid sheet. It is a continent-sized mosaic of floes, plates of ice from inches to many feet thick, from the size of a tabletop to the size of a county, all of it riding on the living sea, pushed by wind from above and current from below. The pieces drift, jostle, split apart, and slam together, and they do this with a patience and a power that nothing made by human hands could resist. When two great floes were driven against each other, the ice between them did not simply crack, It rose. Slabs the weight of houses were shoved upward and stacked into long walls of rubble called pressure ridges, building hour by hour, sometimes traveling across the pack toward a trapped ship like a slow wave of frozen masonry. And the sound, the men never forgot the sound. Pack ice under pressure groans. It creaks like 1,000 doors, booms like artillery, screams in long drawn notes that sailors compared to trains, to enormous hinges, to animals in distress. A ship frozen into that ice felt every conversation of the floes through her hull. On quiet nights, the men in their bunks could hear the ice talking to itself for miles in every direction, pops and shudders and deep organ notes traveling through the frozen sea. And they learned to read it the way farmers read weather, because some of those sounds meant pressure, and pressure was coming for the ship. Here is what it meant to be nipped, as the sailors mildly put it. The floes close on the hull and begin simply to squeeze. The ship, remember the strongest wooden vessel her builders knew how to make, moans. Her beams arch, doors spring open of themselves, cabin floors buckle, the decks bow upward until linoleum tears like paper. Some ships, like the round-hulled Fram, were lifted bodily out of the water as designed and sat groaning but safe on top of the pack. Others were not so shaped, or not so lucky. The Endurance, caught in the Weddell Sea in 1915, withstood months of attacks. The men described her trembling like a living creature, the ice piling against her sides while they stood on the floe and watched, until in October the pressure took her in earnest, twisted her, broke her keel, and opened her seams to the sea. Shackleton gave the order, and 28 men stepped down from their wooden world onto the drifting ice itself, salvaging boats, sledges, tins, the banjo. Weeks later, what remained of the ship slipped under, and her crew stood in the silence afterward on a frozen ocean, 1,500 miles of ice and water from the nearest help, with everything they owned in 3 open boats. We will come back to them, and I promise you, it is a story you can fall asleep to safely. But understand that the Endurance was not unique. She was the rule demonstrated. The Jeannette, an American ship seeking the North Pole, was gripped by the Arctic pack in 1879 and carried helplessly for nearly 2 years before the ice crushed and sank her. Franklin's Erebus and Terror were beset off King William Island in 1846, and the ice that took them never let go. A wooden ship in the pack was not a vehicle. She was a guest, and the ice decided when the visit ended. Now come ashore or onto the great glaciers and ice shelves, because the land ice had its own way of taking people, and it was quieter. Glaciers move, and as they pour over buried hills and bends, they crack, opening crevasses, fissures from a hand's width to wider than a street, dropping away into blue darkness, deep enough in places to swallow a church. And here is the treachery of it. The wind builds snow across the openings, forming lids called snow bridges, smooth and white and indistinguishable from solid ground. A party could march across a dozen bridged crevasses and never know it. Then the 13th bridge takes a man to the waist, or takes him entirely, and the only thing between him and the blue deep is his sledge harness, that worn arrangement of canvas and rope, and the weight of his companions on the other end. The diaries are full of these moments, told with the strange calm of men to whom it happened weekly, the sudden plunge, the jerk of the trace, a man dangling and slowly spinning over darkness, the careful hauling, hand over hand, until he lay on the surface again, getting his breath. Then they brewed tea, perhaps, and marched on, because there was nothing else to do, and the next bridge would not announce itself either. The ice had smaller tricks, too, an entire vocabulary of them. Sastrugi, hard ridges of wind carved snow, like a frozen surf that turned every mile of hauling into a stumble. Whiteout, a windless overcast in which light came equally from every direction, erasing shadows, horizon, up and down, so that men walked into snowdrifts they couldn't see and stepped into hollows that weren't visibly there, sick and dizzy in a world of blank milk. The ice blink and the water sky glows on the underside of clouds that told an experienced ice pilot what lay beyond the horizon. White glare over distant pack, dark stains over open water, so that the men, in time, learned to read the sky like a chart of the unseen sea. And under everything, always motion. Parties camped on sea ice learned that the floor of the world could split at any hour, sometimes through the middle of a camp, a black lane of seawater opening with a sigh where a tent had stood. On the Endurance Drift, the men were turned out of their bags more than once by the crack of their floe breaking beneath them, and once a man in his sleeping bag went into the sea through the splitting ice and was hauled out, bag and all, by Shackleton himself, a heartbeat before the floes slammed shut again. I will give the ice this: the men hated what it did and loved what it was. Their diaries curse it and then, a page later, fall into helpless description. Flows like white water lilies at midnight, bergs glowing green and sapphire, frost flowers blooming on new black ice like fields of crystal ferns. The ice was the enemy, the road, the jailer, and the landscape of the most beautiful things they ever saw, all at once. You wouldn't have survived it, but you would never, ever have forgotten it. Let's spend some time now on the ordinary days, because most days at the ends of the earth were not shipwrecks and crevasse falls. Most days were work, and the work was endless, and understanding it is understanding the life. If you had been there, this is what your body would have been doing. Begin with the most famous labor of them all, man hauling. The British expeditions, especially, moved their supplies across the ice the hard way, men in canvas harnesses, leaning into traces like draft animals, dragging sledges that at the start of a journey could weigh 200 pounds and more for every man pulling. The technique was simple, and the experience was not. You leaned until the trace came taut against your chest, and the sledge broke free with a jerk, and then you marched through snow like sand, snow like sugar, snow with a breakable crust that held your weight for a heartbeat, and then dropped you to the knee thousands of times a day. On good surface, with luck, a party made 10 or 12 miles between breakfast and supper. On bad surface, they relayed, hauling half the load forward, trudging back empty, hauling the second half up, 3 miles walked for every 1 mile gained. Men in harness for 9 and 10 hours a day, on rations that replaced perhaps 2/3 of what they burned, in temperatures that froze the sweat on their backs the moment they stopped. There was a grim joke among them that at least the work kept you warm, and like most grim jokes, it was true, and it was not enough. The Norwegians, and the most clear-eyed of the others, looked at man hauling and chose differently. Roald Amundsen's South Polar journey ran on dogs, teams of tough Greenland huskies, bred for exactly this world, pulling the sledges while the men skied alongside. Done well, it transformed the arithmetic of polar travel. Amundsen's party ran to the pole and back almost on schedule, gaining weight on the return. But dog driving was a craft of its own that took years to learn, and the dogs were a daily labor, feeding, untangling traces that froze into knotted iron, breaking up fights, tending cut paws, building snow shelters for them on the march. The dog handlers grew deeply attached to their animals. The diaries are full of their names and personalities, the clowns and the thieves, and the steady old leaders, which made the hardest part of the system harder still, for on the longest journeys the teams were thinned as loads lightened, and the dogs fed the dogs, and sometimes the men. It was accepted then as the price of survival in a place that offered nothing. It was mourned anyway, quietly, in diary after diary. Scott's last expedition tried a third way. Ponies, sturdy white Manchurian ponies, chosen on a theory and purchased badly, sight unseen. The ponies were willing, and the men grew fond of them, walking beside them through the long hauling stages, building snow walls each night to shelter them from the wind. But the Antarctic was simply no place for a horse. They sank to their bellies in soft snow, their sweat froze on their hides, the blizzards punished them terribly, and their story on the barrier is one of the sadder threads of the age, the men giving up their own comfort, hour after hour, to ease animals that had no business being there, and that could not, in the end, be saved. Even the machines were tried. Scott shipped 3 early motor sledges, wonders of their day, and the cold broke them within miles. In 1911, at the bottom of the world, there was no engineering substitute for muscle, a man's or a dog's, and everyone hauling on that ice knew it. Around the hauling, the days were packed with quieter labor. Depot laying first, the unglamorous life or death logistics on which every great journey secretly ran. Parties went out in autumn and spring to bury caches of food and fuel along the planned route, marking each with a snow cairn and a flag, taking careful bearings, writing down distances. A depot was a promise made to your future self that in 3 months, starving, you would arrive at this exact blank spot in a featureless plain and find dinner buried under the snow. Finding it again was navigation of the old, patient kind, sextant and theodolite, sun sights and dead reckoning, a sledge wheel ticking off the miles, done with numb fingers and fogged instruments, where an error of a single mile in that whiteness could mean walking past salvation without ever seeing it. The navigators of the age performed quiet miracles. Men steered across hundreds of miles of nothing and struck a flag on a stick within a few hundred yards. Every one of those flags found was a small resurrection. And then there was the science, because these were, on paper and often in earnest, scientific expeditions. Wherever the ships wintered, the routine of observation never stopped. Weather readings every few hours around the clock, all winter, in any wind, with a man crawling along a lifeline to read thermometers by lamplight. Magnetic measurements, taken in special huts built without iron nails. The heavens watched, the tides logged, rocks, fossils, eggs, and creatures collected, labeled, and argued over. Seamen found themselves assisting with dredges and balloons and pendulums, and some grew enchanted by it. It is one of the most touching facts of the whole era that Scott's polar party, exhausted and starving on their return march, stopped at a moraine and collected 35 pounds of fossil-bearing rock, and hauled those stones with them to the very end. The fossils of an ancient leafed plant helped prove that Antarctica had once been green and joined to other continents. They were on the sledge when the party was found, men who would not drop the science to save their strength. You may decide for yourself tonight whether that was folly or a kind of glory. The geologists, for the record, have never doubted. Add to all of it the housekeeping of survival itself, cutting blocks of ice and melting them for every drop of water, digging the hut door clear of the night's drift, mending harness, sewing clothes, cobbling boots, tending the smoking blubber stove, hunting and butchering, standing night watch against fire, the one disaster a wintering party feared above all. The day's work ended when the work ended, and the work never truly ended. It only paused for hoosh and sleep. If you take one thing from this part of our story, let it be this: polar exploration was not an adventure punctuated by chores. It was chores, sunup to sundown, and for months at a time, remember, there was no sunup and no sundown. Just the work, the cold, the small warm meals, and the company of the same few tired, patient, joking men, day after day after day, at the absolute end of the earth. We have talked about the cold, the hunger, the dark, the ice, and the work. Now we have to talk about what all of it, added together, did to a human body over months and years, because the polar regions kept a ledger and the body paid every entry. This is the heart of why you wouldn't have survived, so let's take it slowly and gently, the way the men themselves mostly wrote about it, matter-of-factly with a shrug and the kettle going on. Start with the eyes. Snow blindness sounds almost poetic until you learn what it is: a sunburn of the surface of the eye. On the ice in spring and summer, light comes at you twice, once from the sun and once from the snow, which reflects it back like a continent of mirrors, and the burning part of that light works on the eye exactly as sun works on skin. The injury announces itself hours later, in the evening, as a feeling the men described with remarkable agreement: sand in the eyes. Then grit, then broken glass. The eyes streamed and swelled shut. Light, any light, became intolerable, and a strong man was led to his sleeping bag, as helpless as a child, where he lay for a day or two with bandaged eyes, sometimes with cooling compresses or drops from the medical kit, until the surface of the eye quietly healed itself. It almost always did heal. That's the mercy of it. But a sledging party with one man snowblind was a party hauling his share, and the cause was usually nothing more than vanity or haste. Goggles fogged, so a man slipped them off for just an hour. The Inuit had solved the problem ages before with slitted goggles of bone and wood. The explorers used leather and tinted glass, and every spring, on every expedition, somebody learned the lesson again the hard way. Then the extremities, the cold's first mortgage. We've spoken of frost nip, the white patch on the cheek, thawed with a warm palm. But on the long journeys, in the deep cold, frostbite went deeper, and the men's remedies for each other were intimate in a way that says everything about the life. A man with frozen feet sat with them held against the bare stomach or chest of a companion, inside his clothes, skin to skin, sometimes for an hour, while the owner of the stomach gritted his teeth against the cold of it and made conversation. Thawing was the painful part, deep, throbbing, burning pain as the blood returned, and the men dreaded it more than the freezing. When frostbite went too deep for too long, the flesh died, and on the worst journeys, men marched for weeks on feet they could no longer feel, knowing roughly what that meant, because there was no other choice but to march. Some of those men kept all their toes, some did not, and the expedition surgeons did what was needed in hut bunks and ship's cabins with the instruments they had. The American explorer Robert Peary lost most of his toes to the Arctic and went back anyway, more than once, remarking in effect that a few toes were a small price for the pole. You may hear that as heroism or as obsession. The Arctic heard it not at all and dealt with every man the same. Scurvy we have met already, but on the long marches it showed its true pace. It came on like a tide, not a blow, the legs heavy and aching, then swollen and bruising, the gums soft, old injuries waking up after 20 quiet years, and over it all a strange, flat exhaustion of the spirit, which the men fought with routine and jokes and the simple refusal to lie down. The cruelest thing about scurvy was that it punished precisely the longest, bravest journeys, the ones farthest from fresh meat for the longest time, and that its cure all along was dinner. Parties that turned back early and reached the seal meat recovered, sometimes within days, with a speed that seemed miraculous. Parties that pushed farthest carried the tide with them, rising slowly mile by mile. And around these named afflictions gathered a whole weather system of smaller ruin. Lips cracked and would not heal, because healing is a luxury of the fed. Faces blistered and blackened with frost and wind until friends were unrecognizable. Fingertips split at the nails. Sleep, the one great restorer, was itself rationed by cold, men shivering in frozen bags through the night hours, then rising to haul. Hands grew so stiff and clawed that buttons, matches, and pencils became feats of concentration. And beneath everything ran the slow arithmetic of starvation we spoke of earlier. Bodies eating their own muscle to keep the harness moving, men losing 30, 40 pounds on a single journey, until the strongest of them came back to the hut as gaunt, frost scarred, ravenous strangers, and were fed and slept, and astonishingly, in a few weeks, were mostly themselves again, asking what the next job was. The young human body's capacity to absorb punishment and mend was the one piece of equipment on those expeditions that consistently outperformed its specifications. But there were limits, and I will tell you about the man who found them and still came home, because his story, hard as it is, bends in the end toward survival. Douglas Mawson, an Australian geologist, was mapping a stretch of Antarctic coast in 1912 with two companions, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz, far from their base, when the ground itself made the decision we spoke of earlier. A snow bridge failed, and Ninnis, with his sledge, his dog team, and most of the food, was gone into a crevasse without a sound. Mawson and Mertz turned for home at once, 300 miles away, with 10 days' rations, eating as they went the only food the land would lend them, their remaining dogs. What they could not know, because the science did not yet exist, was that the livers of those dogs carried vitamin A in doses toxic to man, and so, on top of starvation, both men began to sicken in ways that bewildered them, skin peeling, strength pouring away. Mertz weakened first and died in his sleep in the tent, and Mawson, alone, 100 miles from safety, his own body failing, the soles of his feet separating so that he bound them on each morning with bandages and wore 6 pairs of socks, walked home. He fell into a crevasse and hung in the dark on a 14-foot rope, and after resting, climbed it, knot by knot, and fell at the lip, and climbed it again. He walked for a month. He reached the base at Cape Denison just in time to watch his relief ship sail away over the horizon, and so he wintered another full year in the windiest place on earth, with a small party left behind to wait for him, and recovered and went home and lived to be an old man with his face on a banknote. I won't pretend that story is a lullaby, but notice the shape of it. The ledger took everything it could take, and the man came home anyway. Even at the absolute bottom of the world, the door home was not always closed. Hold that thought as we turn to the famous disasters, because we're going to walk through them calmly, and one of them, I promise, ends with everybody safe. Every story we've told tonight has been, in a sense, the same story, a plan meeting the ice and bending. Now let's look, calmly, from a great distance, like watching ships from a headland, at what happened when plans did not bend but broke. These are the stories that made the age legendary. They are also, every one of them, stories about ordinary men, the sailors and stokers we began with, and how they behaved when the worst arrived. You may find, as I do, that there is something strangely restful in them, the way there is something restful in watching a storm from a warm room. Begin with the greatest mystery of them all. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin sailed from England with two superbly equipped ships, Erebus and Terror, and 129 men to complete the Northwest Passage, the sea route over the top of America that Europe had sought for 3 centuries. They were provisioned for 3 years. They had steam engines, heated cabins, libraries of 1,000 books, and those thousands of tins of meat and soup. In July, 2 whaling ships saw them in Baffin Bay, moored to an iceberg, waiting for the ice to open. The whalers exchanged greetings and sailed on, and no European ever saw the Franklin expedition alive again. What happened took years to piece together, and pieces are still being found. The ships were beset, gripped by the pack, off King William Island in September 1846, in a region where the ice, fed from the polar basin, sometimes does not loosen even in summer. They waded through one winter, then a second. Franklin himself died aboard in June 1847. The record does not say of what. And in April 1848, after a second imprisoned year, the 105 men still living did the only thing left. They abandoned the ships and set out south across the ice, hauling boats and sledges, hoping to reach the mainland and ascend a river to the trading posts. They left a single page in a cairn, a printed form with notes scrawled in its margins, found a decade later, which is nearly all the writing the expedition left behind. The march was beyond their strength. Scurvy, cold, and starvation took them by ones and twos along the shore of King William Island, and not one man of the 129 reached home. The land kept them. Inuit hunters, who met some of the last stragglers and later guided the searchers, kept the memory, and the sea kept the ships, until our own lifetime, astonishingly, when in 2014 and 2016, the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were found resting on the shallow Arctic seabed, almost intact, their names confirmed after 170 years, with help from Inuit testimony that had pointed the way all along. Dozens of expeditions had gone looking for Franklin. The searches mapped more of the Arctic than the man himself ever did, and the questions, the tinned food and its lead solder, the ice that never opened, the choices made on that final march, are still being weighed gently by historians and archaeologists who handle the relics like family things: a button, a medal, a pair of spectacles. The mystery is quieter now. It has become a kind of memorial, scattered along 1,000 miles of silent coast. Sit with that a moment, and now let me give you the other ending, the one the age earned, the Endurance, Shackleton, 1915. We left his 28 men standing on the frozen Weddell Sea beside the wreckage of their ship, 1,500 miles from help, with 3 open boats. No radio that could reach anyone, no rescue coming, because no one in the world knew anything was wrong. By every reasonable measure, they were already lost, and what followed instead is the most complete survival story in polar history. They camped on the drifting floes for 5 months, riding the frozen sea north as it carried them, hunting seals, living on what patience could provide. When the pack finally crumbled beneath them into the open ocean, they took to the boats, 7 days in freezing spray and gale, the men bailing, rowing, frostbitten, sleepless, and landed on Elephant Island, a ruin of rock and glacier, but solid ground, the first in 16 months. And because no ship would ever pass that place, Shackleton took 5 men and the largest boat, the James Caird, 22.5 feet of her, and sailed 800 miles across the worst ocean on Earth, the open Southern Ocean, in winter, in a rowboat with a sail, navigated by Frank Worsley with a sextant and a handful of sun sights snatched between storms, to the island of South Georgia. They struck it precisely, 16 days. Then, because the whaling stations lay on the island's far side, Shackleton and 2 others walked over the island, over its unmapped interior of glaciers and ridges, in worn-out boots with screws from the boat driven through the soles for grip, 36 hours without sleep, and came down at last, ragged and black with blubber smoke, to the whaling station at Stromness, where the manager, who knew Shackleton well, did not recognize him. And then, this is the part to fall asleep on, Shackleton turned around. It took him 4 attempts and 4 borrowed ships, beaten back again and again by the same pack ice, but at the end of August 1916, he stood at the rail off Elephant Island, counting figures on the beach, and the count came right. Every one of the 28 men of the Endurance came home alive. Not one was lost, not from the wreck, not from the floes, not from the boats, not from the waiting. The men on the beach had been living under 2 overturned boats for 4.5 months, eating penguin, keeping a daily lookout, and the lookout's cry, when it finally came, was simply, "A ship." The age of polar exploration broke many promises. That day it kept one completely. And between those 2 poles, the expedition that vanished entire and the expedition that came home entire, lies the whole spectrum of the age. Scott and his 4 companions, reaching the South Pole in January 1912, to find Amundsen's tent already standing there and turning for home 800 miles away, and being caught at the very last, 11 miles from a depot of plenty, by a blizzard that would not end. The diaries and letters found with them are among the most quietly courageous documents in the language, written by men who knew and who spent their last strength on messages of comfort to the families of their friends. The Ross Sea Party, the forgotten other half of Shackleton's own expedition, laying depots across the barrier for a crossing that never came, faithful to the last 10, three of them lost in the doing of a duty that had, unknowable to them, already become unnecessary, and honored for it ever since. Ships that limped home with stories, ships that left their bones in the ice, relief expeditions that became epics themselves. The men we began with on that gray dock, the able seamen, the stokers, the cooks, stood in the middle of every one of these stories, hauling, bailing, joking, waiting, enduring. Their names are in the muster rolls and on the medals, and here and there, on a headland or a glacier, some grateful officer named after them. The ice does not remember anyone, but we do tonight, and that is its own quiet kind of rescue. Suppose, against every odd we've counted tonight, you made it. Suppose you were one of the ones who came back, and most, it should be said, did come back. The disasters are famous precisely because they were not the rule. What was it like after years inside the ice to return to the world? It began with small things, and the diaries dwell on them with a tenderness that's lovely to read. The first night the ship rode open water again, and the old forgotten motion of the sea rocked men to sleep in their bunks. The first land birds, the first smell of earth on the wind, men stood at the rail inhaling it like a delicacy. The green smell of grass and soil that you and I walk through every day without once noticing. At South Georgia or some northern port came the first fresh food, bread, butter, fruit, accounts of those first meals read like love letters. The first bath in true abundance of hot water, the first sight of a tree. There is an account from one expedition of men simply standing in front of a tree, the first in years, looking at it. A tree. Tonight, somewhere outside your window, there is probably a tree you have not looked at in months. The polar regions teach the price of ordinary things. Coming home was when the lesson paid out. Then came the strangeness. The world had not waited. Men who sailed in 1914 came home into the middle of a world war they had missed the beginning of entirely. The men of the Endurance, rescued in 1916, asked their first question of the whaling station manager, when was the war over? And learned it was not over, and that the world they'd left had in some ways gone somewhere darker than the one they'd survived. Many of them went straight from the ice into uniform. Letters from home, years deep, were handed over in bundles. Marriages, births, deaths, all arriving at once, to be sorted through in a quiet corner of the deck. A man left a father and came home an orphan, or left single and came home to a child who could walk. The ice had held them outside of time, and re-entering it was its own slow journey. The bodies mended mostly, and faster than seems possible. Weight returned in weeks under the assault of regular dinners. Frost scars faded to stories. The men were examined, paid off, and scattered, and here the trail of the ordinary sailor, the man we've followed all night, grows faint, exactly as it always does in history. The officers wrote books and gave lectures in great halls. The seamen took their wages and their polar medals, silver and white ribboned, one of the quietest and most respected decorations a sailor could wear, and went back to the merchant service, the fishing fleets, the navies, the docks. Some kept diaries that surfaced generations later in attics, and historians treasure them above almost everything else, because the view from the lower deck is the true view of the life, less about glory, more about the cook, the cold, the jokes, and the long, long days. And then, and this is the detail I find most telling of all, a remarkable number of them signed on again. Men who had every reason to know better, who had been frostbitten and starved and besieged in the dark, heard of a new expedition fitting out and walked down to the dock with their sea bags. Some sailed south or north 3, 4, 5 times. Shackleton's old hands followed him for decades. When he sailed on his final expedition in 1921, the crew was thick with endurance veterans who had already been through the worst the planet could offer in his company and came back for more. When Shackleton died on that voyage, quietly in his cabin at South Georgia, the gateway of all his adventures, his men buried him there, facing south toward the ice. His wife chose the place. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some men leave part of themselves at the bottom of the world and are forever after only visiting everywhere else. One of his men, asked to explain the pull of it, hardly could. The explorer Apsley Cherry Garrard, who served with Scott, came closest in the opening of his memoir, calling polar exploration the cleanest and most isolated way of having a bad time which has been devised. He meant it as a joke, and he meant it entirely. The ice took everything, gave nothing, promised less, and they went back. Maybe after tonight, drifting at the edge of sleep, with the wind and the rigging somewhere in your mind, you can almost feel why. So, why wouldn't you have survived as a polar explorer? Count the ledger with me one last time, softly. The cold, which owned the air and took its toll from every uncovered inch of you. The hunger, which arithmetic built into the journeys themselves. The dark, 4 months deep, which tested minds as surely as winter tested hulls. The ice, alive and patient, which crushed the strongest ships ever built of wood and hid its crevasses under smooth snow. The work, 10 hours in harness on 2/3 rations. The scurvy no one understood, the snow blindness, the frostbite, the distance, above everything, the distance, the absolute aloneness of a wooden ship beyond the reach of any rescue in an age before radio could call across the world. You wouldn't have survived it. Almost no one alive today would. The honest truth is that many of them barely survived it, and some of them did not. And the ones who did were not supermen, but ordinary working men, sustained by routine, by each other, by hot food in small mugs, and by a patience so deep we can hardly imagine it from inside our bright, fast, warm, deliverable world. That patience is the real artifact of the age. The ships are wrecks and museum pieces now. The patience you can still borrow a little of tonight. We've come a long way tonight, you and I, and before we leave the ice for good, I want to go back one last time, not to the storms or the crevasses or the long marches, but to the gentlest hour of the explorer's day. Because even at the ends of the earth, even in the hardest year of the hardest expedition, there came a moment every single night when the work was done and the men went to bed. Let's watch them do it. It is, I promise you, the best possible company for what you're about to do yourself. Begin aboard a ship in winter quarters, frozen fast in the floe, somewhere in the deep of the polar night. The evening meal is long over. In the wardroom and on the mess deck, the lamps are burning low and yellow, and the day's entertainments are winding down. the chessboard being folded away mid argument to be resumed tomorrow exactly where it stands, the gramophone playing its last record of the night, a thin, sweet, scratchy waltz from a world 10,000 miles away, the last pipes drawing down to ash. Men drift off to their bunks and hammocks in ones and twos with the unhurried movements of people who have absolutely nowhere to be. There's a slow percussion of sea boots being pulled off, of curtains drawn along bunk rails, of bodies settling into blankets. Somebody is already snoring. Somebody else is reading by candle stub. The ship's library has seen him through 3 novels this week, and somebody, as there always is writing in his diary, hunched in the small light, setting down for no particular reader the plain facts of another day at the bottom of the world. Temperature, wind, work done, supper eaten. All well. Through the planking, if you lie still, comes the voice of the ice, those pops and mutters and long organ groans we've learned to hear tonight. But the men around you sleep straight through it. They've long since learned its ordinary conversation from its warnings, the way a farmer sleeps through rain but wakes to hail. The ship herself creaks gently, an old wooden body shifting in her sleep. Up on deck, under the awning, the night watchman makes his slow rounds in enormous boots, checking the stoves, checking the dogs, checking the sky, and his footsteps overhead are the last human sound, crossing the deck planks slowly, back and forth, like a parent moving quietly through a sleeping house. The dogs, out on the floe in their snow kennels, have held their evening chorus, that long, wolfish, rising and falling howl, every voice joining in, that swept the pack each night and stopped always, with eerie suddenness, all at once, as though a conductor had cut them off. Now they're curled nose under tail in the lee of the snow walls, drifted over and perfectly warm, each one a small white mound under the stars. The watchman counts the mounds. All present. He stamps his feet, looks up. The aurora is out again, sliding its green folds across the dark, and he watches it for a minute, alone, the only waking creature in 100,000 square miles. And then he goes below to the galley stove, where the night watchman's ancient privileges await him. The warm chair, the kettle, a slab of bread toasted on the stove top, a mug of cocoa, and several uninterrupted hours in which absolutely nothing is required of him but to keep the fire in and the ship safe while everyone else sleeps. Sailors competed for the night watch in winter. I think you can feel why. Ashore in the huts, bedtime had its own liturgy. The acetylene lights were put out at a fixed hour. Lights out was lights out, even in a land with no dawn coming, and the hut shrank to candle glow and stove glow and the red wink of the watchman's lamp. Up and down the bunks, men burrowed into their blankets and reindeer bags, and the day's last jokes were traded across the dark, growing slower and farther apart, the way the last words always do in a bunk room, until someone delivered the final line of the night to no answer at all. Outside, the wind ran over the roof in its long, smooth river of sound. At some stations it never once stopped, all winter, and the drift snow hissed along the boards, and the stovepipe wire thrummed, and all of it together made a noise the men came home, in later years, to miss. The sound of being safe inside, while the enormous weather went about its business, an inch of timber away. There are worse lullabies. You may be listening to one of the better ones right now. And out on the trail, even there, bedtime came, picture the tent at the end of a hauling day. Supper finished, the pot scraped ritually clean, the primus pumped out and gone silent, which made the tent suddenly very quiet and very cold, so that the men moved quickly through the last chores. Wet socks and finnesko grass spread on chests and stuffed inside shirts to dry overnight with body heat. Yes, they slept with their socks. It was the only dryer on the continent. Boots arranged carefully so they'd freeze in a shape a foot could enter tomorrow. The day's miles entered in the log by candlelight. The candle then pinched out to save it, and then the long wriggle down into the frozen bags we know so well, the shivering weight, the slow growing envelope of warmth. 3 or 4 men packed close as litter mates, the canvas walls breathing in and out with the wind. Good nights were said, brief, ironic, affectionate, and then there was nothing in all the world but the wind, the cold starlight on the canvas, and the small sounds of tired men going under one by one. They slept on the trail like stones. Exhaustion is its own deep mattress. Whatever the day had done to them, sleep undid a little of it every single night, and tomorrow's miles waited politely until morning. Here is the thing I find most moving about all of it. Every one of those sleeps, in the bunks, in the hammocks, in the frozen bags on the high plateau, was an act of trust. Trust in the watchman by the stove, trust in the ice under the tent, trust in the ship's old timbers, in the snow walls, in the man sleeping 18 inches away who would wake you if the floe cracked. Nobody can stand guard over themselves all night. Sleep only ever happens when some part of us decides, against all the evidence if necessary, that it is safe to let go. The polar explorers, in the most dangerous bedrooms on Earth, made that decision every night for years. And night after night, the watch was kept, the stove stayed in, the ice held, and morning came. Your bedroom tonight asks so much less trust of you than theirs did. The walls are solid, the weather is far away. The watch, such as it is kept. You can let go. Let's end where the explorers always longed to be, safe, warm, fed, and still. The expedition is over. There is nothing left to haul, nothing left to fix, no watch to stand. You can let all of it go now. But before sleep takes you, drift with me one last time over the places we've been, empty now and at peace. The Southern Ocean rolls on in the dark, mile after gray mile, with no ship on it anywhere. The pack ice mutters and shifts under the moon, floes grinding softly, pressure ridges rising slow as hours, with no hull anywhere in their grip, only ice against ice, the oldest conversation on Earth, going on whether anyone hears it or not. On the shore of King William Island, the wind moves over the stones, and far below the shallow sea, 2 old ships rest on the bottom in the cold dark, perfectly still, their long watch ended. At Cape Denison, the wind is blowing, because at Cape Denison, the wind is always blowing, streaming over an empty hut whose timbers have been seasoning in the cold for a century, the bunks still in their rows, waiting for no one, and over all of it, over the floes and the empty huts, over the glaciers with their bridged blue crevasses that no boot will trouble tonight, over the high plateau where the snow lies in waves like a frozen sea, the aurora is unrolling its slow green curtains across the stars, folding and unfolding to an audience of nobody, the way it did for 1,000,000 years, before the first wooden ship came south, the way it will for 1,000,000 years after the last one is forgotten. The penguins are asleep on the ice, 10,000 of them, heads under flippers. The seals drowse beside their breathing holes. The whole bottom of the world is one vast, cold, silent bedroom, and absolutely everyone in it is asleep. You are not on that ice. That's the gift at the end of all this. You are home in your own bed in the warm. No harness waits for you in the morning, no frozen sleeping bag, no 4-month night. The cold we've traveled through tonight is on the far side of the world and the far side of a century, and it cannot reach you here, but maybe a little of what the explorers knew can. The sweetness of an ordinary blanket, the luxury of an unfrozen pillow, the deep animal comfort of being inside, while somewhere far away the wind does its work without you. Sailors of the old expeditions used to say there was no sleep on earth like the first sleep after the ice. Borrow that sleep tonight. You've earned it just by listening this far. If you've enjoyed this journey to the ends of the earth, leave me a comment and tell me where history should carry us next. Another century, another corner of the world, another life you're glad you don't have to live. I read every one, and some of our best voyages have started exactly that way. Thank you for spending this night with me among the ships and the ice and the patient, ordinary men of the great polar age. If this helped you drift a little closer to sleep, consider subscribing so you'll always have somewhere quiet to come when the day has been long. Leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see how far these stories travel while the rest of us are sleeping. Until next time, stay warm, stay anchored, and let the wind in the rigging carry you the rest of the way down. Rest easy. This is Drowsy History.